Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I had been on Birchwood Island for just under 2 months when it happened. The place wasn't much more than a thick tangle of pines and birch trees rising from the middle of Lake Vermilion in northern Minnesota, with about a dozen old fishing cabins on stilts tucked along its eastern shore. From the air, it looked like a green blotch in a silver-blue sea of water and sky. To those of us living there, it was a fortress, or so we thought. We'd come here because the mainland was no longer an option. When the first outbreaks started spreading through Duluth and Hibbing, people fled into the woods or towards isolated properties. Word spread quickly about islands being the best bet. No roads in, no bridges, no casual visitors. Birchwood fit that perfectly. It had an old boat dock, a few trails cutting through the forest, and just enough cabins to house 20 of us without anyone sleeping on the floor. I wasn't a local. I came from St. Paul, and before everything went wrong, I worked as a high school biology teacher. When the news first showed those emergency broadcasts and infection maps spreading red across counties, I thought about staying put in the city, but the speed of the collapse changed my mind. That, and the fact my neighbor didn't come home one night, but her car was still in the driveway. I didn't wait for more signs. I packed my camping gear, a bolt-action Remington 700 in .308, and as much dried food as I could carry. A friend in Ely told me about Birchwood, said the people there were organized and taking in anyone willing to pull their weight. When I arrived by skiff, I met the rest of them. There was Carl Jensen, a retired sheriff's deputy who seemed to have taken command by default. Anita Calloway, a nurse from Cook who had set up a small infirmary in one of the cabins. Roger Brandt, a wiry, bearded man who ran a fishing lodge before all this and knew every island on the lake, and about a dozen others ranging from a young couple with a toddler to an older Ojibwe trapper named Elias Red Sky. Each person had a role: fishing, foraging, maintaining the generator, keeping watch. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. The lake was our moat. We figured if the infected couldn't swim, we were safe. We set up a rotation for guard duty, not because we thought anything could reach us, but to watch for boats. Desperate people could be just as dangerous as the infected. For weeks, nothing happened. The wind in the trees, the creak of dockboards, the distant call of loons. It was almost peaceful, if you could forget what was happening beyond the tree line on the far shore. Then came the morning of August 12th. It was Roger who found it. I was walking down toward the dock, fishing rod over my shoulder, when I saw him standing knee-deep in the shallows, staring at something snagged in the reeds. At first, I thought it was just driftwood pale, waterlogged, half covered in weeds. But as I got closer, the shape resolved into a human form. The skin was waxy, bloated from days in the water. The clothes, a torn flannel shirt and work pants, clung to it like wet paper. The face was swollen, the eyes open but clouded. We stood there for a moment. The only sounds the lap of the water and the ticking of cicadas in the trees. "Could have floated in from anywhere," Roger said finally, his voice low. "Currents here will push stuff from the west shoreline straight onto our side." Carl came down with Elias a few minutes later. They used a long aluminum pole with a hook to pull the body to the dock. We all noticed the same thing immediately: no obvious bite wounds. The skin was intact except for the bloating and a few scrapes from rocks. "That doesn't mean anything," Anita muttered when she arrived. She kept her hands gloved as she inspected the corpse. Water hides things. An infection isn't only through bites, it can be from scratches, blood contact, maybe even air in some cases. The talk of airborne spread made some of the others uncomfortable. Carl finally ordered us to wrap the body in a tarp and take it to the far side of the island, away from the cabins. Elias dug the hole, muttering a prayer under his breath before the first shovelful of earth fell. We didn't burn it. There was a debate about smoke drawing attention, but we didn't leave it above ground either. That night, people were jumpy. Even though we'd had the infected on the mainland for weeks, this was the first time one had gotten close. No one said it out loud, but the thought was there. If one body could drift here, maybe more could. Maybe the infection wasn't as far away as we like to think. The next morning, Sophie Madsen didn't show up for breakfast. She was 27, dark-haired, and one of the more capable foragers we had. Her cabin was empty, her pack gone, but her boots were still by the bed. No note, no sign of struggle. Carl sent 2 search teams down the trails that cut across the island. I was with Elias and Anita, sweeping the northern shore. We called her name, checked the small storage shed near the water, even looked under the stilted cabins where kids sometimes hid. Nothing. By late afternoon, we regrouped at the dock. The other team had found nothing either. Maybe she went to the mainland, someone said. But that didn't make sense. No one went to the mainland without telling Carl. It was Elias who voiced what we were all thinking but didn't want to say. If she's on the island and we can't find her, maybe she doesn't want to be found. That evening, as the sun sank behind the far shore and turned water to burnished copper, I sat on the porch of my cabin with the Remington across my lap. Every shadow between the trees seemed a little darker. Every splash in the reeds sounded too close. I wasn't the only one on edge. I could hear the faint clink of metal from Carl's direction, the sound of someone quietly checking their rifle's chamber, and the crunch of gravel as Elias walked a slow circuit near the dock. The lake, which had always felt like a calm, protective moat, suddenly seemed more like a wide, dark trap. Sometime after nightfall, when the sky had turned black and the last orange glow had faded over the western hills, I caught a quick flash of movement beneath the pier, just on the edge of the lantern light. At first, I thought it was a muskrat, or maybe a large fish breaking the surface, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, upright, the water was low, only waist deep near the pier, and I could just make out the pale gleam of skin through the rippling surface. It moved slowly, almost drifting, but with a strange, deliberate steadiness that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I stood and raised the rifle, but before I could get a clean look, it slipped further into the shadows under the dock supports. The angle made it impossible to track without climbing down, and I wasn't about to wade into that water at night. I kept the rifle trained on the spot until my eyes watered from not blinking. Eventually, whatever it was sank completely out of view, leaving only a faint circle of disturbed water. I didn't wake anyone. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe I didn't want to be the one sounding alarms over a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something real. And when I finally forced myself to sleep, the image of that pale shape in the water wouldn't leave me. The next morning started like any other. Anita was cooking oatmeal over the propane stove in the communal cabin. Roger was already out on the lake checking his nets, and Carl was going over the day's watch schedule. But Sophie still hadn't returned. By now, people were openly speculating about her. Some thought she might have tried to swim to the mainland. Others whispered that she'd been hiding symptoms and had gone off into the woods to die quietly. Nobody wanted to talk about the possibility that she might still be here. I decided not to mention the movement under the pier, not yet. Without proof, it would just fuel more paranoia, and Birchwood was already running on the edge of that. After breakfast, Elias asked me to help him haul some firewood from the far side of the island. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, the air damp and smelling of cedar and lake water. As we worked, Elias spoke in his low, steady way, not looking at me. "Back when the ice still covered the lake, people thought nothing could live under it," he said, wedging his axe into a round of birch. "But the fish still moved, things still hunted. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there." I didn't need to ask what he meant. He'd been on edge since the corpse drifted in. By midday, the weather had turned heavy, clouds gathering in a thick gray ceiling. The wind picked up, sending small waves slapping against the rocks. Roger came in early from his nets, complaining about the current being stronger than usual, dragging debris towards the island. That was when Carl decided we'd reinforce the shoreline watch, not just at night, but all day as well. If anything else washed in, we'd be ready. Late that afternoon, while I was standing the North Shore watch post, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Wedged between two half-submerged logs was another body smaller than the first, but in the same waterlogged condition. I called for Elias, and together we used a long pole to bring it in. It was a boy, maybe 16, wearing a soaked hoodie and cargo shorts. His skin was pale and bloated, lips tinged blue, but there were no obvious wounds. Anita confirmed he had no pulse, no breathing, no chance of revival, but she was quick to point out again that there were no bites. Carl ordered the same protocol as before, wrapped in tarp, buried on the far side. The ground there was starting to look disturbed from the new mounds. That night, the mood on the island shifted. People kept to their cabins earlier, lanterns were turned down low, and conversations were quieter, broken by long silences. The two corpses had arrived within days of each other, both without wounds, both somehow ending up on our shore. We couldn't pretend it was coincidence anymore. Around midnight, I woke to a faint, irregular thump from outside my cabin. It sounded like someone stepping onto the wooden walkway, pausing between each movement. I sat up, listening, the rifle already in my hands. The thumps came closer, 2, maybe 3 slow steps, and then stopped right outside. I didn't breathe. My cabin had a single small window near the door, and through the thin curtain I caught the silhouette of a figure. Shoulders hunched, head tilted, just standing there. The lantern light from a distant cabin caught on the outline for barely a second before it moved away, slipping silently into the trees toward the shoreline. I wanted to believe it was one of the others, maybe someone checking on me, but I knew everyone kept to their own cabins at night. And there was something wrong with the way it moved, too slow, too deliberate, like it was feeling its way through the dark. By morning, the shoreline was littered with new debris. Pieces of broken wood, reeds, and among them wet footprints leading from the water into the trees. They were bare, human in shape, but warped somehow. The toes splayed wider than normal, as if the skin had softened and swollen. The prints glistened in the slanted morning light. Each one pressed deep into the damp soil before vanishing into the ferns. Carl didn't like what he saw, and neither did I. He called for everyone to gather at the main cabin, the one with the long porch and the big wood stove that served as our meeting spot. The group filed in slowly, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, most of them holding mugs of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. Elias stood near the doorway, silent as ever, and Anita kept wringing her hands, her jaw tight. Carl didn't waste time. "We've had another water landing," he said. "No body this time, but someone came ashore last night, barefoot, walked straight into the woods, didn't leave." He scanned the room, making eye contact with each of us. "Nobody leaves their cabin after dark without telling me. Nobody. We need to account for every person here." He started reading off names. One by one, people answered until we got to Sophie. Again, silence. Her absence was no longer something anyone could brush off. Carl set his coffee down with a deliberate clink and looked at me. "You saw her last?" I shook my head. "Not since the day she went missing." But that wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it. I thought of the silhouette outside my cabin, the way it had moved toward the shoreline, and my stomach turned. If that had been Sophie, she wasn't the same person anymore. The rest of the morning was spent combing the island. We split into teams again, each armed, each moving with more caution than before. The forest here wasn't large, you could cross it in 15 minutes, but the thick undergrowth and uneven ground made it easy to miss someone. Birds startled and wheeled overhead as we pushed through the pines, our boots crunching over pine needles and fallen branches. By midday, my team Anita, Elias, and I reached the northern marsh, a low, muddy stretch where cattails and sedgegrass grew thick along the shore. That's when Elias stopped, raising a hand. He crouched, studying the ground. There, half hidden by bent reeds, were more footprints, the same swollen-toed impressions as before, but fresher. The mud around them was still wet from the water they'd tracked in. They led away from the shoreline, weaving between clumps of brush, and then vanished into a patch of shallow water choked with lily pads. I scanned the area, listening, but the marsh was quiet. Too quiet. No frogs, no wind through the reeds, just the faint sound of water lapping against the roots. That's when we heard it, a low, wet rasp, coming from somewhere ahead. Not a growl, not a moan, but a slow, struggling breath, the kind someone makes when their lungs are half full of fluid. Anita's hand tightened on the grip of her sidearm, a Glock 19 she kept holstered at her hip. Elias raised his old Winchester Model 94, holding it just below his shoulder, and gave me a nod. We moved forward carefully, each step sinking slightly into the muck. The rasping grew louder until we rounded a cluster of alders, and there she was. Sophie stood ankle-deep in the water, her back to us, clothes soaked and clinging to her frame. Her hair hung in dripping strands, plastered against her face. At first, she didn't move, didn't react to us. Then her head tilted slightly, as though she'd heard something distant. Anita called her name, no reaction. When she finally turned, I knew instantly she was gone. Her eyes were clouded, the irises pale and milky. Her skin was mottled gray-blue, as if the blood had drained away. And when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out was nothing human, a ragged exhale that bubbled faintly, like water still sat in her lungs. She took a slow step forward, then another, the water parting around her legs. We all backed up, weapons raised, but Elias spoke first. "Don't let her get close," he said, voice flat. Anita hesitated, her face twisting in something between grief and disbelief. "She doesn't have any wounds. This isn't—" Sophie lunged then, sudden and jerky, closing the distance faster than I thought she could move in water. Elias fired first, the .30. 30 round, cracking the still air, and Sophie dropped instantly, the impact splashing water in all directions. She floated face down, her dark hair fanning out like ink in the current. Anita's breathing was shallow, and she wouldn't look at the body. Elias and I waded in just long enough to pull her to the bank. She was lighter than I expected, her soaked clothes heavy, but her frame feeling almost hollow. We didn't bring her back to camp. Carl's orders were clear. If someone turned, they didn't come near the cabins. We dug the grave right there, in the shadow of the pines near the marsh. By the time we returned, word had already spread. No one said it aloud, but the reality had settled on all of us. Sophie hadn't been bitten, and yet she'd turned, which meant the lake wasn't our barrier anymore. Whatever was happening on the mainland could reach us in ways we hadn't prepared for. That night, Carl doubled the watch. We set lanterns along the pier, their reflections dancing in the water like a broken chain of fire. I volunteered for the midnight shift. Standing there with my rifle, listening to the lap of the waves against the pilings, I kept thinking of those wet footprints and how they hadn't led back to the water. They were still out there, stamped somewhere in the soil, fading with the weather, but no less unsettling in my mind. The lake was quiet at first, only the occasional ripple where a fish surfaced. The air smelled of damp pine and faint wood smoke from the cabin chimneys. I had almost convinced myself I'd see nothing that night when a faint disturbance caught my eye far beyond the lantern light. It started as a ripple, too large for a fish, moving steadily toward us. The moon was behind a layer of thin cloud, giving the lake a dull, pewter sheen that made every shape harder to judge. But then I saw the silhouette of a figure, upright, head and shoulders above the water. It wasn't swimming. It was walking. The distance was deceptive on the water, but from the pace I could tell the thing was moving along the lake bed itself, each step sending faint ripples ahead of it. My first thought was that it had to be shallow there, but I knew that stretch of lake the depth dropped off steeply just a dozen meters from shore. There was no way anyone should have been able to walk there without sinking under completely. I raised the rifle and peered through the scope, though the dim light made it hard to pick out detail. The head was tilted slightly forward, the hair plastered flat and dripping. I couldn't make out the eyes, but the mouth seemed to hang open, and every few steps the figure's arms lifted and dropped as though they were fighting the drag of the water. I kept the scope on it until I heard footsteps behind me on the pier. Carl came up, carrying his shotgun and a heavy flashlight. "You see it too?" he asked quietly. I nodded without taking my eyes off the scope. "It's coming straight for us. Walking. No boat." He switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting across the water in a silver-white line. For a moment, it just glared against the surface, then the beam found the figure, and I heard Carl draw in a sharp breath. The thing was less than 50 yards out now, and the light caught its face. It was slack, pale, water dripping from its chin in a steady stream. The clothes clung to it like a second skin, and I could see strands of lakeweed trailing from its arms. The eyes reflected the light in a dull, milky way, no recognition in them. Carl didn't hesitate. He braced the shotgun and fired. The report slammed across the lake, echoing off the distant shoreline. The figure staggered backward, water splashing high around it, but it didn't go down. Instead, it righted itself and began moving again, arms swinging more stiffly now. I fired next, a crack of the .308 louder and sharper than the shotgun. Through the scope, I saw the round punch into its upper chest, spinning it partially to the side. This time, it went under, sinking below the surface. We waited, both of us holding our breath. 30 seconds. A minute. The water calmed, ripples fading. I thought maybe that had been enough then. 2 yards closer to shore, it came up again. Carl swore under his breath. "Aim for the head." The next shot dropped it instantly. It didn't float right away. Instead, it drifted under the pier, bumping against one of the pilings before sliding deeper into the shadows. We couldn't see it after that, and neither of us was eager to lean over and look. We stayed on watch until dawn, and by the time the others emerged from their cabins, the lake looked peaceful again. But when Carl told the group what had happened, the effect was immediate. The idea that the infected could walk the lake bed shattered any sense of safety we had left. If they could move unseen under the water, they could come from anywhere, any time, without warning. The plan shifted quickly. Roger and Elias started rigging more lights along the shoreline, stringing old work lamps from cabin to cabin and setting up gas-powered floodlights on the dock. Anita checked our supply of ammunition and found it worryingly low. Most of us had only a handful of full magazines left. Once they were gone, there'd be no resupply from the mainland. By mid-afternoon, I was helping Roger unload extra netting from his skiff when we noticed something strange near the eastern cove, a dark, irregular patch just beneath the surface, as if the weeds were thicker there. But when the boat drifted closer, I realized it wasn't weeds. It was hair. There were at least 3 bodies standing on the lake bed, just beyond the drop-off, their heads barely breaking the surface. They weren't moving toward us, just standing there, swaying slightly with the current. We didn't approach, we didn't speak, we just backed the boat away, the outboard motor sounding far too loud in the stillness. That night, we doubled the watch again, but my mind kept returning to that image, those still figures in the cove, waiting just below the waterline. They weren't coming right away. That was the part that unsettled me most. The infected I'd seen on the mainland had been relentless, chasing anything that moved, battering through obstacles until their bodies gave out. But these, they were patient. They stayed just beyond reach, close enough for us to know they were there, but not advancing. It was as if they were letting the fear do their work for them. The floodlights we'd strung along the shore cast deep shadows into the forest behind us, making it impossible to tell if someone was standing between the trees. Every so often, a breeze from the west rippled the lake and sent shimmers across the beams, giving the eerie illusion of movement out on the water. I kept my rifle trained toward the cove, but the surface there remained still, as if whatever lay beneath had sunk deeper. Carl had reorganized the watch into overlapping shifts, so there was never a moment when fewer than 4 people were on duty. He also started enforcing a buddy system. Nobody went anywhere alone, not even to fetch firewood. The mood was tense. Every conversation clipped, every sound in the dark met with too much attention. Just after 3 a.m, I heard the first splash. It came from the north shore, far from the cove. Elias was posted there with one of the younger men, Daniel, a quiet guy from Duluth who had been here since the start. My first thought was that one of them had dropped something into the water. But then came a second splash, heavier, followed by Daniel's voice calling out sharp, urgent. Carl, who had been pacing between the dock and the main cabin, turned and ran toward the sound, shouting for me to follow. By the time we got there, Elias was standing at the edge of the tree line, rifle raised. Daniel was nowhere in sight. The beam of Elias's flashlight jittered across the water, catching nothing but ripples. He stepped forward to get a better look at something in the water, Elias said, his voice taut. Next thing I know, he's gone. No scream, no thrashing, just gone. Carl swore under his breath. We searched along the shoreline with the flashlights, but the water was opaque under the artificial light. If Daniel had been pulled under, there was no telling where he'd surface, or if he would at all. We were still at the north shore when Anita's voice came over the handheld radio from the dock. Her tone was strained, urgent. Movement in the cove, multiple shapes. They're heading toward you. The forest between the north shore and the cove wasn't large, but it was enough that Carl had to make a quick choice: run back toward the dock to reinforce it, or hold the line here in case the infected tried to flank. He decided to split the group. Elias and I would stay put, while he and 2 others sprinted toward the dock. The first figure emerged from the water barely 50 feet from where we stood. It was one of the bodies from the cove, a tall man in a soaked plaid shirt, the pattern barely visible through the algae and silt coating him. His skin was a sickly gray, bloated from long immersion. His mouth hung open, water spilling from it in slow, steady drips. He didn't rush, he just walked. Each step slow but certain, the water receding from his legs as he made landfall. Behind him, two more figures surfaced, one listing to the side as if a shoulder was dislocated, the other dragging a length of rope tangled around its ankle. Elias fired first, the crack of his Winchester echoing off the trees. The lead figure dropped instantly, face first into the shallows, but the others didn't flinch. I took aim at the second one and squeezed the trigger. The recoil thudded into my shoulder, and the round took the top of its skull cleanly. It fell backward into the water, sending a splash up over its own face before sinking. The third kept coming. Its hands were open, fingers spread, nails cracked and blackened from long exposure. I fired again, the shot striking center mass, but it barely staggered. Only a headshot stopped it, dropping it into the mud just short of the tree line. The silence that followed was short-lived. From the direction of the dock, the gunfire was constant now, sharp and frantic. The floodlights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. Through the gaps in the trees, I could see shadows moving fast along the shoreline, too many to count, and all heading inward. We fell back toward the main cabin, meeting Carl halfway. His face was pale under the strain, and there was a fresh scrape across his temple. "They're hitting from both sides," he said quickly. "Roger's down, still breathing, but bad. We have to pull everyone to the center and hold." The cabins had never been designed for defense. They were fishing shacks at heart, thin-walled, elevated on stilts to keep above the snow in winter. But they were the only shelter we had, and Carl wanted to use them to create a bottleneck. We pulled people inside, nailing shut the lighter doors and barricading the heavier ones with furniture. The windows were darkened, the lanterns extinguished except for a few covered lights inside. Outside, the lake was alive with faint splashes and the distant sound of something dragging through the shallows. The first impact came against the side wall of the cabin I was in. It wasn't a battering like in the city, more of a probing push, as though the infected were testing the structure. The wood creaked under the strain, and I could hear the faint scrape of nails against it. Someone else in the cabin muttered a prayer under their breath. An hour passed like that, pressure against the walls, occasional splashes, no full assault. Then, from the far corner of the cabin, we heard it. Water dripping steadily onto the floorboards. One of the younger women pointed upward and my stomach sank. A section of the ceiling near the back was damp, a faint trickle running down from it. The cabin was over the water, and whatever was under there had found a way up. The sound of the drips was steady, rhythmic, almost taunting. I moved slowly toward the trapdoor in the floor, an old square panel used for lowering fishing lines in winter when the lake froze. It had been nailed shut months ago, but now one of the nails had bent upward, the wood splintered around it. Another wet thunk came from beneath as something heavy pressed against the underside. The boards flexed, the water seeping in around the edges, turning dark. I gestured for everyone to stay back, motioning to Carl's nephew Mark, who had a heavy splitting maul in his hands. We stood on either side of the trapdoor, rifles ready. The pressure from below increased, the wood bowing upward. Then, with a sharp crack, the panel gave way. A pale, bloated arm shot up through the opening, followed by the top of a head. The smell hit first brackish water mixed with the decay as the figure hauled itself up with inhuman steadiness. Its hair hung in slick ropes, skin stretched and waxy, eyes milky and unblinking. It didn't snarl or scream, just reached for the nearest shape it saw. Mark. I fired before it could touch him, the shot punching through the temple and snapping its head to the side. It collapsed halfway through the opening, but the weight of it dragged more water up, and I saw movement behind it in the dark gap. more shapes in the water, waiting their turn. Carl's voice crackled over the radio from the next cabin. "They're under us too. Coming up from the lake. Hold your ground." We didn't have the luxury of holding for long. The first body was dragged back down into the water as if something below had claimed it, and in its place, another arm reached up. Mark brought them all down hard, the steel head crunching through bone, but before he could pull it free, a second hand caught his boot and yanked. He hit the floor hard, sliding toward the opening. I grabbed his arm and hauled him back as the thing beneath lunged higher, its head and shoulders breaching the floor. This one was smaller, maybe a teenager once, but its jaw hung at an odd angle, swaying as it moved. A quick burst from my rifle dropped it, but more hands were appearing now, fingers curling over the wood, nails scraping for purchase. "Out! Move!" I shouted, and we pushed everyone toward the door. Outside, the night was chaos. The beams from the floodlights swung wildly as people fired at shapes coming from the shoreline. I saw Elias near the main cabin, his Winchester bucking in his hands, and beyond him, Anita dragging a crate of ammunition across the dirt. Carl was already shouting orders, trying to pull everyone into a tighter defensive ring, but the infected were coming from every direction now, walking out of the water, crawling up from beneath the cabins, staggering through the trees. The ground was a mess of wet footprints and churned mud. We formed a line near the central clearing, firing into the nearest shapes. My ears rang with the overlapping cracks of rifles and shotguns, the slap of wet feet on packed dirt, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. Still they came. At some point, I lost track of Mark. I caught sight of him again just as an infected reached him from the side, knocking him down. Carl was there in an instant, pulling the thing off and putting a slug through its skull, but Mark didn't get up. His shirt was torn. Though I didn't see blood still, the look on his face told me enough. The line was breaking. We were running out of room to fall back, and the cabins were no longer safe. Carl made the call none of us wanted to hear. "To the boats, now." The dock was already half overrun when we reached it. Roger was on his knees beside one of the skiffs, trying to untangle a mooring line while keeping his pistol aimed at the nearest figures wading toward him. I covered him as best I could, dropping two before they got too close. Behind us, Anita and Elias were ushering the last of the survivors forward, their faces tight with urgency. We piled into the first boat, 8 of us, more weight than it was meant for, and pushed off hard, the motor roaring to life. The second boat followed close behind, spray hitting my face as we swung away from the island. I turned for one last look and saw the floodlights flickering, the cabins silhouetted against the chaos of moving shapes. The infected didn't chase far into the open water. A few waded out until the depth took them under, their heads still visible for a moment before slipping beneath the surface. Others just stood at the shoreline, watching us drift away into the dark. Nobody spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the motor, the wind, and the faint lap of the lake against the hull. My rifle lay across my knees, barrel still warm, and all I could think about was the way those figures had waited in the cove. They hadn't attacked until they knew we were surrounded, until they knew we had nowhere else to run. And now, out here on the lake, I couldn't stop wondering how many more of them were already walking the lake bed beneath us. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.